in the sense of empirical work, that ideally you would need a bunch of people who are similar, and then you would want some of them to be hit by a particular shock, which could be a positive shock or a negative shock. And then you want to look at their transition behavior over time and then try to figure out what is happening to that. Because otherwise, if somebody is saving up a lot and then eventually getting out of poverty, that could well be that that person is dynamic and would have kind of done that anyway and should not be compared with others who are less forward looking or have a lower saving rate. So this is a very kind of basic problem, right? And that is why compelling evidence on this is hard to find, right? Now, one of the things I would like to do here is first give a bit of a theoretical outline in terms of how we would want to think about this poverty trap view in contrast to the kind of more standard convergence or the growth theory view where poverty would be a transient state. So it'll be a kind of bit of a theoretical kind of conceptual framework that sets our mind to the empirical work. But after that, I will move straight to the empirical work because that is what this paper is really adding mainly to the literature. So this is a standard figure that all of you have seen in economic growth context, that we basically have KT is on the horizontal axis, KT plus 1 on the vertical axis. So these are all some measure of capital, physical, financial, human capital. Here, mostly I'll be taking physical capital as the interpretation, which is relevant to the context. And this transition equation really gives us a mapping from initial capital to next period's capital. So this is exactly the kind of accumulation behavior, which in a dynamic setting, whether it's the Solow model, neoclassical growth model, you have some kind of transition equation that comes from the capital accumulation dynamic problem, right? So the question, what I said in kind of verbally, can now be mapped to this diagram. Namely, suppose we see two individuals, L and H. This is what we are observing at any given point in time. How do we know that their underlying transition equations are different? And that's why this person is at a higher level and this person is at a lower level. Versus, what about this situation where the underlying transition equation is the same, but it is not one that displays the kind of smooth and kind of concave shape that would imply convergence. Rather, it has non-convexities. Here I have drawn a particular version, S-shaped form, but this could take many other forms as well. And how do we not know that whether this is the case where L is here and H is here? And if L is given a bit of a push, then essentially a positive accumulation cycle will take over and this person will eventually go to H. So this is a very canonical figure of any kind of poverty trap setting. And I'm here applying it to the context of sort of capital accumulation. But as you all well know, there are many other settings in which this can be done, including macroeconomics, low level versus high level of economic activity, search models, nutrition and productivity, all sorts of different settings in which a similar kind of dynamics could be at work. So as I said, that the problem with observational data is accumulation of capital is endogenous to individual characteristics and circumstances. And so even if we have a panel, it will be driven by shocks that are correlated with individual characteristics and circumstances. And so movements around L and H cannot be used to identify. So ideally, as I said, now mapping into this particular diagram, if we could find a number of people, say here, and then see whether some of them are moving here, some of them are moving here, because they arbitrarily fell short of this threshold for an unstable steady state. As you know that there are three steady states in this diagram. This is a stable one, this is a stable one, and this is an unstable one, right? Then we would be getting somewhere. But the trouble is, and this is again a very kind of basic but subtle and important conceptual issue. In reality, you're not going to observe too many people who are around this point. Why? Because by definition, it's an unstable steady state. So think about this way. So think about a physical analogy. So suppose there is a slide, right? Sort of a curved slide like you see in playgrounds, right? So if you see a bunch of kids on top and you see a bunch of kids on bottom, right? And then you're wondering, why are the kids on top versus why are the kids on the bottom? Ideally, what you want to see is kids who are exactly at the cusp point here, and then see who are the ones who are falling and who are the ones who are, going up, right? So here, the trouble is, by its very nature, this point is not going to be stable. So in general, you're going to observe a bimodal distribution of some folks who are bundled here, some folks who are kind of bunched around here, and then you have the basic problem. Okay, so this is really the core problem that in some ways makes identifying any kind of poverty traps hard. Okay, so what we do here, and now I want to come to the empirical setting and how we approach this problem, is essentially what we do, and I will talk about the empirical setting in detail for most of the rest of the talk. Essentially, what we're going to do is exploit a particular randomized controlled trial that my colleagues and co-authors on this paper, Oriana Bandier and Robin Burgess, carried out in their long-term study with BRAC, which is an NGO in Bangladesh, one of the largest in the world, and their ultra poor program, which basically gave a large sample of rural women in Bangladesh, a kind of capital stock, right? A big capital stock. That's their ultra poor program. And then that was the treatment group, and there was a corresponding control group. And essentially the whole kind of exercise was try to figure out whether for the very, extreme poor, maybe for those whom microfinance or other kinds of anti-poverty programs are not sufficient to bring them out of poverty, whether you actually need a shock in the capital stock to bring them above a certain threshold level. So what we basically do in this paper is look at essentially individuals who were initially, there was a baseline survey where we can track how much capital they had. And then everybody is receiving a similar size capital injection. And then we want to test that those whose initial capital was less than a certain threshold, are they more likely to fall back to their original level? And those who had capital which was slightly larger than the initial level, threshold level, are they more likely to go above, right? And that is going to be the core idea behind our test. So here I just use a diagram to illustrate this. So as you can see that if this was a kind of more standard convergence type framework, then initially you would have a number of people who are distributed on the x-axis, KT, the initial capital. Consider somebody who's here, K0A. If you give this person capital delta, which is the capital transfer, then that will put this person here, and the next period he will be accumulated more capital, and this would eventually get this person up to the steady state. Whereas if you take somebody who has more than the steady state and you give this person extra capital, as you know by the standard logic of these models, this person will decumulate and eventually fall back to the original position. So this kind of gives us, if we put K0 on the horizontal axis and delta 1, which is just defined to be your KT plus 1 minus KT, namely whatever your extra accumulation, the incremental accumulation, as you can see that this is the point at which it will intersect the 0 axis, right? So if you're K star minus delta, then having delta, you will exactly not change your behavior because you have just hit the steady state. If you had more, then you're going to decumulate. If you had less, you're more likely to accumulate. Contrast the same story, but now with a S-shaped transition equation, right? And if there is if we carry out a similar thought experiment, now you can see, suppose take somebody who has initially very little capital, and then consider somebody who initially had relatively high amounts of capital, and suppose somebody who had intermediate levels of capital. Now we can see that for the very poor, there will be actually decumulation because you are not getting enough, and therefore you're going to go back to the steady state, the low steady state. Now for this person though, is close enough to the threshold, then having an extra capital would lead to positive accumulation behavior, which would then taper off at this point. And of course, if you had lots of capital, then if you have extra capital, you will decumulate. Okay, so if you actually mapped K0 and delta 1 in this particular setting, we can see that there is going to be a non-monotonic relationship between K0 and your accumulation behavior, which is in contrast with the monotonic behavior around the steady state, which was negative in the previous case. Okay, and this is exactly our theoretical framework, and this is the point at which I would now make a transition to how we go about to testing this in an empirical setting. Okay, I will pause here for a second in case there are any clarifying questions about the terminology or any of the things that I said so far. But as was agreed at the beginning, more substantive questions can be taken up in the Q&A session. Okay, so I will now go to the empirical setting and what we do in this paper. So we use the randomized controlled trial of a large asset transfer program in Bangladesh to implement a direct test. I will not talk about the structural estimation and things we do about occupational choice. That's for, that you can look at the paper for those details. So let me talk a bit about the setting and then I will go straight to the test. Okay. Shaunak, if you could give me a alert at about 5 minutes before the allocated time of 40 minutes, then that'll be great.
Sure,
Okay?
sure.
Okay. So what I'm going to do now is describe a little bit of the setting here, because that's important in our interpretation. So basically, this is the BRACS targeting the ultra-poor program in northern Bangladesh, right? And there's an earlier paper that my co-authors studied, where they look at the average effect of this program as opposed to the dynamic accumulation behavior, which is a test of the poverty trap model that we carry out in this paper. So the data covers about 21K households, of which over 6,000 are extremely poor, okay? And that is defined in terms of ex-ante asset classification thresholds, right? If you have certain assets below a threshold, then you're labeled extremely poor, otherwise nearly poor, et cetera, et cetera. Now, these are about 1,300 villages in the 13 poorest districts in the country. And the poorest women in randomly chosen villages receive an asset with some training, okay? And this asset, typically the modal asset choice that the women made was basically cow, like livestock, because that is the most desired asset in this particular setting up to a certain level. After that, it becomes land, okay? So these transfers, I will mention the sums here, were basically good enough for getting a cow, and that is the kind of dairy farming was kind of very small scale dairy farming is what these women do. So this program offers a one-off transfer of productive assets and training with the aim of simultaneously relaxing credit and skill constraints to create a source of regular earnings for these poor women who are mostly engaged in irregular and insecure casual labor, which is mostly agricultural labor as well as domestic services. Not very different in compared to many other Indian settings we can think about. So beneficiaries are offered to choose from several asset bundles, all of which are valued around $560 in purchasing power parity terms, or 10,000 Bangladeshi taka in 2007 when this evaluation, this whole exercise started, and can be used for income generating activities. 3,000 was the treatment group and 3,000 was the control group, which is very helpful given what we have in mind, okay? 90% plus women chose an asset bundle containing a cow. BRAC encourages respondents to retain the asset for at least 2 years, after which they can liquidate it. Okay, so to identify the beneficiaries, BRAC runs a participatory wealth assessment exercise in every village. And this kind of gets us the various classifications. The ultra poor households, who account for 6% of the population, and that's a population estimate, are eligible to receive the program, and other households are ineligible. And the physical assets that of these women that are surveyed and measured are productive assets, which include poultry, livestock, tools, machines, vehicles, and land, and all converted in money values. So this was done in several rounds. So the baseline survey was conducted before the intervention in 2007. 2 follow-up surveys with the full sample were done in 2009 and 2011, and 2 further survey rounds were done in 2014 and 2018 that collected data on households eligible for the programs. So what are some of the stylized facts before we get into the main part of our analysis? Well, the stylized facts are as follows. Even through this long period through which the poor are kind of tracked, the poor tend to stay poor, left to their own devices. And how do we know this? Because we are tracking the control group, right? Hierarchy of jobs correlated with community-defined poverty. In particular, those who are asset poor tend to be employed in agriculture and domestic service. The richer among those are self-employed in livestock rearing and land cultivation. And moreover, the productive assets set rich and poor apart. So the relatively rich in these villages, asset rich, are 94 times higher asset holdings than the relatively poor. The richer households own more expensive and indivisible assets, okay? Wage labor is uncertain, seasonal, and pays less per hour. And therefore, anybody who should be able to afford the assets and get into some of the self-employment activities should be wanting to do that. And that's where our theory that it is possibly the indivisibility and the lack of ownership up to a certain threshold that is constraining this one. Okay. So I've already said some of this, so I'll skip some of the details here, right? And these are some of the details about how these surveys were carried out on the various rounds. So this is an important and interesting figure to look at because you have log of productive assets on the horizontal axis, right? And it's a probability density function that is estimated. So the treatment group is indicated by the red and the dashed line is the control group, right? I'm sorry, that is exactly correct. So the dashed blue line is the control group and the red one is the treatment group. And the size of the asset transfer in the scale essentially pulled a bunch of people from this point to about this point. And this is where you can see the bulge. So that after the treatment, a bunch of people were thrown into around this kind of threshold, right? And that's where you see the change in this. Okay.
So, Maitresh, what does this tri-model distribution signify? I mean, the one in the lower strata would mean the one who did not gain, or what does these?
Yeah, so sure, Somesh, just to be clear about the diagram.
Yeah.
The dashed blue line are the control, right?
Okay.
And for the period we are studying, nothing is happening to them. They are just being tracked. Okay, that's why they're a control group. Yeah. So let's therefore focus just on the treatment group, which is the red, right? So in the red, what you have is an initial distribution, right? Yeah. And that is something we just take as given. If I did a survey of the audience member today, right now, right, I will observe some distribution, right? And I'm just describing empirically that that happens to be this particular one if we just focus on the red one. Yeah.
Right.
But now, if you look at the intervention, so suppose in the current audience, I gave half of them the capital transfer and other I don't, then essentially what happens is there's a change in those who were initially having this distribution. Now some of them have moved here. Is that clear?
Right. So I'm just thinking aloud. Say,
Somesh, I would, if it's a clarifying question, let's do it because otherwise I haven't come to the main thing.
Right,
but if it's a terminological clarification, that is something to be clarified now. Otherwise, I would prefer not to have more open-ended discussions, which I for the Q&A. All right. But if it's a clarifying, please don't hesitate to ask because it would matter for our interpretation.
Sure.
Okay. So what happened in this earlier study that Bandiera et al. Carried out was looking at the average effect of this program. So once again, the analogy I gave, think of, say, a cohort of students, And we have some existing distribution of the assets they own, for example, laptops and other electronic things that might be relevant to their productivity. And then we have a program in which half of them are given, say, a kind of, advanced laptop, a state-of-the-art device, and the other half is just being studied, right? And we just want to look at what is the average impact. That is the first thing that you want to study, and this is what the earlier paper looked at. And they find that there's been a significant positive effect among the treatment group after the transfer, 4 years after the transfer. They devote a lot more time to livestock rearing, less time to agricultural laborer, right? Overall, there is a net positive effect on hours worked and days worked, and suggesting that poor women earlier had idle work capacity that was not being utilized because of lack of complementary assets. Okay, so that was kind of the finding of the existing paper or the earlier paper. Now, one of the interesting things, in fact, it's pretty striking, is if you look at this second bullet point, 4 years after the transfer, the ultra poor in treatment villages have more than 4 times the amount of savings, and they were more likely to receive and give loans to other households. So this comparison is with respect to the control group who did not receive the transfer. So among comparable groups, those who got an asset transfer, they were generating enough income and saving more out of this income. That was nearly 4 times the amount of the savings of the other group, okay? Now I want to come to the core thing, that this is the average effect, but for some, this was not enough and they fall back and to a lower level, earlier level, or close to earlier levels of capital stock. And this is where we want to sort of test what I motivated this talk to start with, as to what was the, whether there was a role of the initial endowment, because otherwise, if you take a more standard convergence kind of mechanism, you would not, you would expect a certain accumulation behavior. But if you have a poverty type mechanism at work, you will observe a different accumulation behavior. And that's our main exhibit, okay? And after that, I will, of course, stop and then take any questions that, that might come up. So basically, what we kind of want to do is the following, that suppose we have this KT here and KT plus 1, and this is the theoretical diagram that would that we have from an earlier setup where we had convergence, right? It's a kind of well-behaved transition equation. Now, this is what we empirically find, okay? So this diagram is going to be important, so I want to spend the next few minutes really talking about this diagram, and this is a blown up version of it, okay? So let me first show the blown up version, and then I'll come back to the earlier one where it's being contrasted with the theoretical one. So once again, like with those bimodal things, let me be very clear about what these graphs are capturing. So first of all, the axis. So on the horizontal axis, you have baseline productive assets post-transfer. Okay, so this is in log scale. So these are money values converted into log scale. And this is baseline productive assets post-transfer. So suppose you had K0 initially. What we have on the horizontal axis is log of K0 plus delta to relate it to the theoretical notation we developed earlier. Yeah. So that's all there is, okay? Who are we looking at? And again, for your interpretation out of it, do pay careful attention to what I'm saying, because otherwise it is not, will not be straightforward interpreting it. We are only looking at the treatment group here. These are the people who got the asset. We know their initial assets, right? And on the horizontal axis, we are basically having the baseline productive assets post-transfer log value of it, yeah? Now what we have on the vertical axis is productive assets in 2011. Yeah? So if you look back at what we had done earlier, right? So in the theoretical diagram, so on the horizontal axis, we have K0, right? And on the vertical axis, we have K1, right? This would be the theoretical counterpart to that exercise. And this is what we see. If you now look at this, this particular non-parametric way we estimate, and this is a real curve we are estimating. We are literally plotting the baseline productive assets post-transfer, the log value of it, and productive assets in 2011, the log value of it, and basically fitting estimating this non-parametrically. what we see here, the behavior in terms of the initial asset level and the relationship between what you have seems to display exactly the kind of non-convexity that the earlier curves indicated. Namely, if you seem to have a bit more than this threshold level of capital, and this dashed line exactly simulates a 45-degree line, okay? And the reason it's not appearing like that is because the axes are not exactly symmetric here, okay? So what you can see is those who had above this initial level, threshold level of capital, actually had higher levels of capital in period 2011. So this was their initial, they actually grew. And those who had below actually had less. They had some initial bump, but after that, they actually had less. Okay, and that is kind of the main finding in terms of this is what you would expect. If I now go back to my theoretical diagrams, see, look at these two curves. This is what would happen if you had a kind of convergence type setup, right? And this is what you would have if you have some kind of non-convexities, where you will have that basically, if you're below a certain level, right? And I'm going to come back now to the empirical diagram. You're going to fall. If you're above a certain level, you're going to rise. And then if you're, of course, above a very high level, then you're again going to fall. And kind of, this would therefore be a stable, steady state. Of course, this is a non-parametric estimation. We can also use a parametric estimation of this particular relationship between K1 and K0, right? And K0 taking into account the transfer that was given, yeah? And basically what we have is a curve that would be fitted like this. So it is this, the underlying, the dark blue one is the non-parametric one, and this one is a polynomial of degree 3, okay? So we can also look at what happened to the control group, right? We can also look at their behavior during this period, okay? And if you look at their productive assets in 2007, once again, the log scale, and see here the log scale is generally lower because you have those guys did not have an asset transfer, and therefore in the horizontal axis, we are not looking at assets, initial assets plus the transfer. And if you look at productive assets in 2011, this transition kind of behavior, right? I mean, if you just map K1 to K0, resembles more the standard kind of convergence type behavior, right? That you basically have some kind of a steady state around this point, yeah? So that really is our main finding. We have a number of regression exercises, which I'm going to show you. Okay, I'll have to skip some of the details, but let me show you some of the regressions we run and then do a lot of robustness checks and testing for unobserved productivity, etc. I will not have the time to go through all of that, but let me at least present the core regression result. So what we have is here, we again run this regression based on the first panel, the first column is the treatment group, where all the observations are from the treatment group. The second column refers to the control group, and the third one has both the control and the treatment group, okay? So if you just look at the treatment and control group, we are running the same regression, namely, is it the case that their capital stock in period 2011, right, is positively related to whether their initial capital stock plus the transfer exceeded this K hat that we empirically estimated earlier, non-parametrically, right? And we can see for the treatment group, there is a positive relationship. So that is a confirmation of what we saw in the diagram. In the control group, there is no significant relationship, as you would expect. And when you put in both the control and the treatment group, once again, you have a significant positive effect if you interact a treatment dummy with the fact that whether they were above the threshold or not. Okay. So basically, this is our kind of core finding in terms of what is happening to the treatment group and what is happening to the control group. And it addresses one of the problems that you could think of in terms of what we do here in identifying the effect of this transfer. that you could argue that, hey, during this period, lots of things could be going on. So even maybe export opportunities would change, that would change the wages, etc. So is it the case that the control groups were also displaying a similar accumulation behavior, and therefore maybe this particular asset transfer program did not have the estimated effects that we are attributing it to? And clearly what I'm showing here is a confirmation that something is happening to the treatment group and that is not happening to the control group. Okay, so I think, how am I doing in terms of time? So according to my calculation, I'm nearly done, but maybe Shaunak, you can alert me to the time I
Sure.
have already.
You can take about 5 to 10 minutes, as you
That's
please.
okay. So I think, in fact, given us the questions that could be coming, I
Mhm.
would possibly like to wrap up in 5 minutes and then basically go to whichever section would be more profitable, given the kind of questions that would come up, including what Shomesh asked earlier.
Sure.
Okay, so what we do in the rest of the paper is kind of look at a number of ways of establishing this kind of core discontinuity that we see in the control group, in the treatment group as compared to the control group. But next, there's a whole section of the paper where we deal with the following issue. That you could argue that, hey, what we observe in these control and treatment groups is their initial capital level, right? But we don't necessarily observe their productivity. We don't necessarily observe their saving behavior or saving propensity. And maybe there's heterogeneity there. So how do we take into account the fact that there is heterogeneity, and maybe the pattern of evidence that we are seeing is consistent with a non-poverty trap model, but where heterogeneities play a big role. So again, I don't want to cram a lot of fairly dense work we do here in a short time to leave you perhaps more puzzled, but let me give you a qualitative summary of what we do. The qualitative summary of what we do here is allow for the following. Because we can track these individuals, both control and treatment, over a long period, we can actually estimate their productivities as well as their saving rates quite well, right? So therefore, the nice thing about having a data set like this is that you actually have a measure of whatever their observed characteristics are in certain dimensions, right? Such as saving and productivity, etc. Then we can use the theory model to argue the following, and which is pretty intuitive, namely, the higher is your productivity or the higher is your saving propensity. Some people are just more forward looking, they're more entrepreneurial, they're more dynamic, right? The lower will be the threshold to cross. Yeah, so once again, think about the following exercise. Suppose there's this slide, very slippery slide in a park, and suppose we do that experiment, maybe not with kids, maybe that's not the most responsible thing to do with kids, but suppose all of us participate in this thing, that we run fast and then try to see whether we can run up to the very top, or some of us maybe will only reach to the middle and then maybe slide down, right? So if you use that as an analogy, then the basic poverty traps theory is the further you are away from this slide or slip, as it's called in India, you're more likely to fall because you're not going to get enough traction. Whereas if if you just exactly get a critical amount of running distance, you might actually be able to overcome the point at which you go above, right? So here, the analogy to unobserved productivity or unobserved saving rates would be some people just run faster. So whatever is the distance, some people just can run very quick. They can generate more acceleration. And maybe they will be able to overcome this barrier more easily. So what we do is we estimate this different thresholds for high productivity versus low productivity livestock farmers among these women, as well as high saving propensity and low saving propensity, and then run a similar regression to what we ran before, but allowing for this difference. And once again, we find very similar behavior in terms of the threshold effect. So that's kind of the core exhibit of this section of the paper. Anyway, so let me look at the time. So I would, yeah, sorry, is somebody trying to speak?
I guess, no, I guess not. I think it might have been just a glitch in connection.
That's okay. So let me kind of wrap this up because there's a number of things. I have, I think, about 140 slides, which would be, even for a regular length seminar, would be a little ambitious. But here, let me get to a few policy-related observations, okay? Like as we know, sort of, in the end, for development economics, for a lot of these programs, the motivation for this study, of course, was in a way testing for poverty trap mechanisms, which is an academic exercise. But in the end, we are interested in policy implications. Okay, so this may be, of course, of interest to us as academic economists as to whether poverty trap mechanisms are in operation. But is it the case that that would change our view about policy? So I will just conclude with the following thought. What this poverty trap type mechanisms or their presence implies that interventions are going to have small effects. To have a substantial effect in terms of dent on poverty, you would need the intervention to be somewhat substantial, right? Now, to a non-economist might think that it almost sounds tautological, but it's not tautological. All this says is suppose you have a budget of X crore rupees, yeah? If you divide it up equally in small chunks and give it to a lot of poor, yeah? What this is saying is you're going to be helping. Everything helps especially if you're very poor at that stage, everything helps, right? But it's not going to help them overcome poverty in any substantive way. It would be more of a temporary relief. Yeah, to have a more substantive dent on it, you might be better off giving larger chunks to a smaller group of people. So that is the bit of the policy implication that is not trivial at all. It doesn't follow from the definition, right? And moreover, it's not necessarily politically also very palatable, because think about some of the trade-offs that would imply that if you have a certain budget, and see, even within families, we know, and this is something we can all, I'm sure we know of stories or experiences or anecdotes. Suppose you're from a very poor family. Suppose you cannot send all the children to school. Often they have to make tough choices, right? In terms of the indivisible amount of money that I need to get my child a good education. Often that would go to one child or two child, and especially sometimes, in the case of women, typically they would get the brunt of not being, receiving this, right? So some of these tough trade-offs, of course, are often have to be carried out. But also, I would end with the following thought. One of the things that I always find a bit kind of puzzling and frankly not very helpful in our policy debates is, see, like the human health, there are various kinds of ailments. So if you think of poverty as a form in which it's a form of economic ill health, it is an ill health that is preventing people from reaching their full economic potential, if we define or think of poverty in that way. There are many ailments that could cause poverty, right? And we don't have to necessarily take a stance as much as there are many health problems that our human bodies face, right? So therefore, the moment I present it, I often hear the reaction, so is that the one policy you're advocating? I said, never. As with human health intervention, it would very much depend on the whole range of ailments people are facing, right? And therefore, it would very much depend on what is the particular critical ailment a particular group is facing, right? Before having a blanket one-size-fits policy or a magic bullet that if you do this, you will just reach the perfect state. So therefore, I would say, therefore, for certain kinds of persistent poverty, this is a good policy if one can afford it, but the underlying trade-offs and choices are, as I pointed out. Anyway, I'll stop here.
At this point, I would request if anybody in the audience has questions, please feel free to unmute yourself and pose your question directly to the speaker.
Maitresh, amazing clarity. I'm sure my colleagues Shoini and Sharani, who have expertise in growth and development, they have more to say. But as I was referring to that diagram,
Sure.
it's all about that that critical level of capital, um, which is important. So I was saying that think of a class which has relatively, students with modest background. Then there are students who are mediocre. Then there are students who are quite good. And so you need to define what sort of education should be given. That threshold is important. So my question relates to how did you get that threshold level? One. And second is something I want to go back to this Gunnar Myrdal, Prebish, and Nerks's theory were critical of the development and the trade in the Asian economies. So, uh, question is how to break this persistence of poverty. So that comes to the policy part. So I have one technical one. How did you get that threshold level? Or in terms of this class, how to give that level of education so everyone moves up the ladder, whether it's the one with the modest background, the one mediocre, the one who's already good. Uh, so,
Sure.
yeah.
So first of all, yeah, both are relevant and good questions that kind of come naturally out of the topics or the issues that came up. So about the first, this would be kind of my general answer. So see, this program was designed by BRAC with financial collaboration with DFID back in 2005, right? And Fazle Abid, who's the head of BRAC, it's a bit like, so therefore, and this is not undue modesty, it's just correcting the record. I had nothing to do with it, okay? So it's a bit like, if I study Grameen Bank's microfinance, it's like, how did Muhammad Yunus come up with that $100 or $200 or whatever amount that? So it's a valid question as to how did BRAC come up with this number? So your question is a valid one, but we had nothing to do with it. I mean, certainly not me and certainly not my co-authors also. But so there are two parts to your question. One is, how do you figure out the threshold? Okay. So this, if you think about it, this is very hard. So even right now, we all of us are facing a pandemic, and that's one of those common global shocks everybody is facing, right? So how do we know that which vaccine would work well, and whether you would need a booster, with people with existing conditions, what will happen? So this is a very profound problem of any intervention, because the success of an intervention may depend on certain behavior of general behavior, right? Whether, more is good or it's good but at diminishing rate, etc. Versus those who have a family history of heart disease, those who have a lung condition, for them these would be different. So what I'm drawing here is the medical analogy. So you're exactly right that if we want to do it with the students here, right? So think about, IIT students, or maybe IIT students are likely to be selected to be such that, they are there for perhaps, but think about a college where you have students coming from very, very different backgrounds, right? And with a certain distribution of ability and potential, yeah? So now, of course, suppose again, theoretically, let's think about these are independent, that we just don't know. You have high or low quality in terms of, ability or potential, and you also come from rich or poor background. And let's assume it's, sort of, the two things are independently distributed, which doesn't have to be, but for our so see, given the nature of this data set, all we know is a laptop was given, if I draw the analogy. So in this setting, it's a rural setting, livestock, poor women. So that was a cow largely in this urban educated setting. So all I know was, say, a Dell laptop or a MacBook was given. And then I'm basically looking at, are these guys, going on to accumulate more such capital, right? I mean, or do they are selling off their thing and maybe doing some chota mota sort of, thing, right? So that would be the analogy. So beyond that, there's not much we can infer from this, because ex post, the intervention was one and only one. So that's why we have to go about a bit indirectly as to estimate their differential productivity, estimate their differential saving behavior, and see if the thresholds could be lower or higher. That's why we go through those exercises as to how much role heterogeneity is placing. That's one. But your second question, which is maybe one part B, is a really good one, because see, how did Brack figure it out? So clearly, I mean, why? And the thing is, in the end, I think sometimes nature offers solutions which our human eyes then have to, do a lot of theorizing to figure out. At the risk of sounding a bit facetious, but I actually mean it. That's because cows are indivisible. Cows only come with 4 legs and a full body. It's an indivisible thing. It's like a car. You can't get a 2/3 of a car. In principle, you can, because you can share. Two students can share a car or share a, say, motorbike or something, right? But therefore, going back to your question, Somesh, they must have done enough village service. This is what I know from the indirect kind of evidence I have from those guys, as to what was the modal occupation among the more affluent of the women on those villages, and that tend to be livestock farming, right? And then that value is just the value of a cow, right? So, and the cow comes in this indivisible unit. If it was more flexible size of capital, then your point would be much more that how do you throw a dart and you hit it exactly right? How did they figure out, right? So therefore, that would be kind of part B of your question. So remind me a bit about your second question. So I think I've answered the one party and part B. So remind me the second question.
Just going back to the 60s, where
Oh,
Professor
right, right.
Gunnar Myrdal and Nurse and Prebis Singha were very critical of the development process in the developing nations. So I was just thinking that how to break this persistence of poverty. Is it ICT? Is it clustering, agglomeration? I mean, the policy things that you were talking about, or making internet cheaper or something. I mean, that way.
No, fine. No, absolutely. So see, it's a very kind of big picture question, but one that kind of comes naturally if you reflect on these set of issues or programs. So first of all, we should distinguish macro and micro, right? So clearly something trade as a mechanism as an engine of growth, right? And then you have the Prebish Sengar come, all those guys about Immanuel Wallerstein, Andre Gunder Frank, all these guys who are saying maybe even the trade process is hopelessly biased against developing countries, primary exporting developing countries versus, industrial goods, the kind of stuff that happened during the colonial times with the British dumping manufacturing and kind of thereby undermining Indian artisan things, whatever, right? So even trade opening is not a mechanical guarantee for success, but surely there are macro factors. And if you look at China or East Asia more broadly, or even our neighboring Bangladesh, which have been successful in cotton textile kind of exports, so has been Sri Lanka. So surely trade has a role to play. And therefore, like I gave the analogy of the human body, so clearly having less pollution in the environment or better roads can only help, right? So similarly, having a better trade regime where we have more demand for our export goods, that would induce demand for unskilled labor as well as skilled labor. Their children can then go to school, that kind of stuff. So that mechanism, certainly I would, if you take a holistic view, one can never be opposed to that, because in the end, you need a whole range of exercises or policies to do that. So clearly that macro level stuff. Second, right, you rightly pointed out the agglomeration type things, right? There's a reason why, say Bombay is what it is, or Calcutta is what it is, and Delhi is what it is. But then you have smaller towns, which kind of, so urban agglomeration is one example. Industrial complexes or industrial clusters grow up, etc. And once again, they display these kind of positive feedback or self-reinforcing feedback, right? Which may be, which is very. So again, I would say those macro policies are certainly complementary with some of the stuff we are talking about. Just to give an example, very concrete example. Suppose milk was not so perishable, or there was a milk processing plant near these Bangladeshi villages, and you could immediately export this milk to, say, medium or higher income countries. Whatever this program evaluated, right, immediately it would have done better, because the prices or the returns that these women then would get from their livestock dairy thing would be much better, right? So therefore, this shows the complementarity between these asset transfer programs and macro level policies such as trade and exports, etc. So, okay, so I will, kind of stop here. But if you look at the paper at your leisure, you'll see we do get into, so therefore, this is a much more narrow thing. It's like, okay, I'm just going to look at your kidney issues. It is not to say you should not have better diet, you should have better, air to breathe in, all those things. So just for, if you have a certain budget for transfer, then my general view, and I've written a fair bit on universal basic income, etc., even in the Indian context. So my view is we have to take into account two views of poverty. One is poverty as pain relief, that somebody who's very hungry, even if you can manage to give this person 100 rupees, that is helpful, because that may be what is preventing this person from, having a meal or feeding his or her family versus not, right? But we should not have any illusion that this will have any medium or long-term effect, because you're literally, it is a more like a immediate relief kind of thing. So this is where I would say what our paper is suggesting, that if you're going to have transfer programs, make it more substantial or distribute it more equally, so to distribute the relief more equally, because otherwise you would need a bit of a big push for people to get out of the traps they seem to be in. Anyway, perhaps there are other questions, but thanks for these questions, and hopefully I've addressed them.
Thank you.
So Professor Ghtak, I had a question, and my question is: so what? If I understand,
if you don't mind, if you turn on the camera, it's just easier. It stimulates more a regular interaction. Yeah.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. So.
Yeah, Shaunak, can you that screen, because then we can see everyone.
Exactly, that would be kind of nice.
Yeah.
If you don't mind, if you switch on your camera, that creates more of a regular.
And you can stop sharing, because that way.
Yeah.
Okay, I will stop that. Yeah. Yeah, I've stopped the sharing.
Yeah. So if I understood you correctly, what you showed us is that there was a threshold above which people who were given the asset transfer, they had KT plus 1 greater than KT, and below the threshold people had KT plus 1 less than KT. And I was wondering, like, if it might be possible to follow these people through, say, some further periods of time to see actually whether the people who have KT plus 1 get greater than KT are actually converging.
So we have, so I didn't have the time to present it, but we have some more evidence on the long-term impact of this transfer. So if you go to my website, I don't have, I may even have the slides, but there wouldn't be enough time to go through it carefully. So yes, it is true that they are converging to some kind of intermediate level, which brings us maybe to some of the questions that Shomesh had asked, namely, what next? So you have pulled these people from very ordinary agricultural labor type things, which has uncertain and low returns. So this is better. But then that's where they are. It's not, causing any radical changes in their cost, a standard of living. It is positive. And so therefore, what would be other interventions, etc. But yes, there is evidence that they kind of plateau out. It's not like they're starting the mother dairy or Amul type thing. And I say this again, it's not meant to be a funny thing, because indeed you want to ask that what is preventing some of these women to kind of get together and form some kind of either cooperative or some kind of a milk processing unit, which would have economies of scale.
Thank you.
And hello, I'm Sharuni.
Hi.
Hi. So do you also have any, maybe you have it in your paper, I haven't read it. So do you have any other, so you have showed it like for the threshold, but I was thinking that are there any other individual variables for which, some characteristics of women below the threshold who will get this, who will go to, who will show this type of behavior rather than for some other, like in terms of, say, some like how autonomous women are, or age, or I mean some individual
Yeah, so
might
So
matter.
yeah, so Sharani, if you could turn your camera on, again, it's not essential, but it's always helpful. Otherwise, I'm just looking at a blank screen, so it's
Yeah,
easier.
yeah, sure.
Uh, so yeah, going back to your question. So see, we are limited, but by what our sample allows, right? And there are a number of characteristics, like you mentioned, whether it's autonomy, whether it's a female-headed household versus whether the husband is around, or whether this guy's a migrant worker, and so on. So bottom line is that age does play a factor. There is a life cycle element, and for some of these women, especially when their children get married, we see that there's assets are changing. So there's a life cycle thing. So you go up to a point, but when you marry off either your son or daughter, right? But beyond that, one of the things that, so this maybe is the kind of philosophy of research. This paper is really testing for poverty traps, and we do look at the alternative roles of saving rates and productivity, right? And some aspects of age. But clearly in any empirical setting, there are 1 million factors you could take into account, right? Including the role of certain social norms in these villages, how strong the social networks are, and so on. So I would say we only focus on a few of these. So that's a good question, but as you can imagine, that within the scope of this research, we are just interested in this indivisibility behavior based on asset ownership, and that is really the main thing. And there are many other things one could in principle look at.
Thank you.
Maitresh, we have Debayan also, who has worked extensively on Bangladesh, and he has a paper in JDE. Debayan, would you like to?
Yeah, hello, hi.
Hi,
No,
Devang, could you turn the camera on? Sorry to be, yeah, if it's difficult, then don't, never mind.
yeah, actually, yeah, I can, yeah. I'm, hello, yeah,
Yeah, no problem. Yeah, it's just useful to see somebody's face when answering a question. Yeah.
yeah, sure, sure. Yeah, like I have no particular comments. I am also, for my PhD thesis, I have also worked on poverty traps. And but in not in this respect, mine was more about technology trap and how certain countries actually um, takeoffs and others don't at a particular time. So it was more about takeoffs, landing, and the role of technology trap in that respect. So yeah, I really enjoyed your talk, as I have no particular comments.
No problem. Good luck with your work.
I always enjoy your paper.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah.
And we have
So
so many students.
yeah.
Students wish to pose a question. Shohini is also here.
Please go ahead. Please don't hesitate. I will address your question, and no question is unimportant enough.
They did ask me, but secretly, that are you a student of Professor Banerjee?
Yeah, I am one of his. If you look at Abhijit Banerjee's list of students, his earliest two students would be me and Kaivan Munshi. So so Abhijit and I have a well-known paper on tenancy on Operation Borga in West
Yeah,
Bengal.
yeah.
So that's joint work with Abhijit, and I have several other papers with him. So absolutely, he was my co-supervisor before even becoming, a senior faculty. So it was while I was in graduate school that then he got his first position at MIT, and of course now he's a household name for since 2019. But yes, he's a friend and a mentor for a long time. Interestingly, and I don't, this is all funny because at the time when I became their student, they were all, of course, stalwarts, but one wouldn't be able to foresee these things. My main supervisor was Eric Maskin, and he sort of, and who was Abhijit's supervisor too. So, and of course, Eric also won a Nobel Prize in 2008. But yeah, I graduated in the late 90s, so this was well before. In fact, Amartya Sen was a teacher. I wasn't his, I took his course, but he was not in my committee or whatever. But yes, Amartya Sen got his Nobel Prize in '98. So anyway, so that's yeah, it's always very, very rewarding and satisfying when you get to work with such stalwarts.
So I had a question about the policy implications.
Sure.
And so I was wondering, so given that we have a traps set up, so in terms of targeting transfers, would it not be a good idea to target, if we could, to target people who are just below the threshold, then a little transfer would get them above the threshold and they would converge the good steady state?
Yeah, that's a valid and good point. Except for the following problem happens. Econometrically, given what we are doing, we are so thankful that they didn't do that, because that would destroy the exogeneity. If the target is based on ability, right, then, or whatever else, right, then it's not again clear econometrically how are we going to identify these thresholds, right? So like a lot of exogenous shocks that people use in empirical work, it is better that they are kind of blunt shocks that are not too tailored to individual characteristics or regional characteristics. But yes, if you are a planner or a policymaker, you would exactly want to distribute this differentially. But having said that, see, we, as people, Bella Balasa is the one who supposedly have said this. Every economic problem we solve is a solved political problem. And the reason I raise it is the following. Think about it, right? I mean, optimal mechanism. That assumes there is no mob roving around and taking away people's property and stuff. So you have to assume a certain institutional framework before we can design optimal policies and mechanisms, okay? So coming to what you're saying, leaving aside the political issue, there are ethical concerns, and that is something that have plagued our city whole paradigm, right? Because there's a sense in which, suppose you have a bunch of very hungry people, yeah? How do you right? I mean, things, who is going to get the program versus who is not going to get the program, right? And if you tailor it, right? Suppose students who are more promising, you give them the laptop, and who are less promising, you don't give it. There are equity considerations that you would then bump into. So that, so again, I always feel that in the end, we have to always try to have these conversations between, it's like doctors, you have to figure out what is the technical aspects of medicine or treatment. So that is a technical thing. And for that, the more random the distribution, the better for me, because I can then tease out what is happening, right? But then the whole ethics issue comes up, right? I mean, what are you basing the experiment on? Who are you giving it to and not, right? Even with the vaccine, right? Who gets it first, etc., right? And third, of course, is the political will and political kind of economy of this. So suppose elections are coming up, how are you going to allocate the transfer program? You're going to give it to constituencies that are tighter in terms of the votes and so on. So both the economic side of it, then the kind of equity or social welfare side of it, and then the political economy of it, they will always be at work together. And there's no easy answer. Certainly I don't have any, but I don't believe there are any easy answers.
Thank you. And that's a very insightful response. I mean, thinking about so many things, and one needs to think of them in one. I mean, as an integrated. I mean, integrate the different aspects of policy making. I mean, policy making is always more complicated than our models would. I mean, than we would want to conclude based on just our models. So
Exactly.
So do we have a question for Professor Ghtak from some of our PhD students who are here? Mm, looks like we have run through the course of questions. So, okay, so if there are no further questions, we take this opportunity, Professor Ghtak, to thank you one more time for sparing so much of your valuable time and talking to us, taking the time to talk to us and share your insights. It was indeed a very insightful presentation and empirical evidence on a topic which we have read about so much, but as you rightly mentioned, empirical evidence is hard to come by for precisely the very reasons that you described. It would be great to go over your paper, and I will certainly do it. Many of us, in fact, would want to read the paper and to understand more of the details and the insights it has for policy. Professor Mathur, would you want to add something?
No, Shaunak, do get the mailing address of
Yeah, sure.
Professor Maitresh, and we are thrilled actually to have you here, and we hope that the association will not just stop with this, and at least the communication will go on. And we are, of course, Facebook friends. I don't know, he knows it. Yeah, but surely we want to have a longer association.
Absolutely. No, thank you for inviting me. And of course, when we growing up, IITs, I don't know when the economics department started, but we always have because I didn't go through the engineering track. So we always had this, the other track, right? The kind of ones that say Raghurajan and others did. So IIT Kanpur, I know of many graduates there who are all gone on to very, very distinguished careers. So I'm very happy now that I think all of them have now social science units and economics, etc. And so, yeah, thanks for having me. I always, any sort of Indian institution in which there is sort of, interest and work going on, I'm always happy as an NRI to chip in and participate and be involved in any way I can. So I think our human capital is something that I'm still amazed at the kind of students that always come up. It's genuinely very, very sort of nice to see the generations of students who come out. So yes, Somesh, will definitely be in touch, and so we'll be happy, to continue our conversation.
Sure. And so once we are done with COVID and all of this, once we are a bit more back to normalcy, it would be great if you could, when you visit India, like if you could visit us, it would be really great. So we would.
I'll be happy to. Yeah, no, I do go to India very regularly, and this is the only time in my life I'm sort of stuck here, and it's a bit unfortunate. But yes, no, I go several times a year, and hopefully it will resume sometime soon.
Sure.
Okay, very good.
Thank you
again
much
for having me. Thanks for your comments and your interest in this, and let's be in touch. All right.
Thank you. Okay.
Okay, bye.
Bye-bye.